In 1776, the world changed forever. The old, traditional methods of governance were being discarded, and a new, brilliantly colorful method of government was established. The success of the United States' Great Experiment led to the adoption of republican forms of government all over the world. Before this time of experimental governance, the world had been ruled primarily via traditional, long-lasting, dynastic governments, known as monarchies. With the apparently brilliant success in the New World of a government that was supposedly by the people and for the people, other like-minded aristocrats around the world realized that it was possible that they too could throw off the old kings and queens and rule for themselves, ostensibly for the people. Like dominoes, the nations of the New World resisted their faraway monarchs, and due primarily to the vast ocean separating them from the monarchical seats of power and resupply, these primitive nations set up autonomous governments, all loosely based on the American model. And as all new things are so tantalizing to the human mind, the old European countries began to despise their own rulers and wanted a shot at ruling for themselves. Only a couple of hundred years after the violent expulsion of British monarchical authority in the United States, this experimental government had become the most common form of government in the world. According to a Pew Research poll done in 2017, out of 167 countries with populations larger than 500,000 people, 96 had so-called trustworthy democratic governance, and an additional 46 had a combination of autocratic and democratic forms of governance. The remaining nations were generally autocratic. In 2017, 85% of nations larger than 500,000 people were found to have had some form of democratic government. It should not be a surprise, then, that the majority of people in the world no longer remember what it was like to be well and truly ruled by a king. In the United States, people generally speak of kings and tyrants in the same sentence, as though they were the same thing. While this rhetoric may be popular, it couldn't be further from the truth. According to the Democracy Index, as measured by the World Population Review in 2021, the top 10 highest-rated countries in the world for democracy are number 1, Norway, Iceland, Sweden, New Zealand, Finland, Ireland, Canada, Denmark, Australia, and Switzerland. And 70% of the top 10 highest-rated nations in the world are monarchies. Clearly, the king is not the problem here. What has contributed to the unfortunate misconception surrounding the monarchy is that many persons who have clearly been tyrannical over the ages have claimed to be kings. Henry VIII is an excellent example, and this particular person strikes home for me, since he killed off my great ancestor, the Duke of Buckingham, and forced my family to flee to the Americas. He claimed the title of king, but he was no king. He was, in fact, a cruel and wicked tyrant. It's the age-old quandary. I can claim to be anything I want. I can claim to be an astronaut, but just because I say I'm one doesn't make it so. So how can you tell the difference between a monarch and a tyrant? There are several definitive methods that can be applied to any person, which will determine his or her legitimacy as a monarch. The first is whether or not the government is hereditary. This specifically refers to the fact that the king is replaced by his eldest son. If there are any deviations from this specific path, then the nature of that form of government is suspect. This line of succession method defeats several tyrannical urges that a potentate might have by ensuring that he has no ability to twist those around him into servile obedience in order to potentially ensure their succession. In fact, the monarch ought to be completely helpless in choosing his successor, because that will force him to try and have a relationship with his children. In a situation where the king knows that he cannot help the fact that this unruly boy of his will succeed him whether he likes it or not, if he wants the government to carry on his personal legacy, then his only recourse is to try and teach his son how to be a good king. If, instead, the ruler is allowed to choose his successor, as happens in most communistic dictatorships, he will inevitably choose the man who had most succeeded in contorting his values and beliefs into an image of the dictator, and who had successfully managed to cut down those around him, thus reducing the value of his competitors. It is not hard to imagine, then, why the inner circles of dictators are always mysteriously losing members, or why they always seem to be composed of the oiliest snakes imaginable. The second measurement is whether or not the ruler accepts a form of a god above his or her status. This is an often overlooked, but fundamental, indeed crucial, element in the measurement of whether or not a person is a king, or a tyrant, or something else. The reason for this item on the monarchical checklist is that if a person perceives no higher authority over themselves than their own whims, they will allow themselves liberty to do tyrannical things that are in their own interest, but not in the interest of their subjects. Religion has been and always will be the greatest check on a ruler that can ever exist. Religion is capable of doing something that no other power on earth can, and that is to govern a man's actions when nobody is watching, and when that man thinks that he might be able to get away with something. Rulers that either abandon a belief in a god or gods of some kind, or that enter an egomaniacal trip and elevate themselves in their own eyes to the level of godhood, essentially the same as denying God or the gods altogether, will strip from themselves the high office of monarchy in short order. It is impossible to know a person's heart, so whether or not a ruler truly believes is as irrelevant to the measurement of monarchy as anything could be. It is enough that the ruler submits publicly to a church authority. This has historically been done by priests engaging in ritual ceremonies, where they might anoint the king to be with oils and then smear them with interesting-smelling tinctures, as in ancient days, or in the more famous ceremonial crowning of the monarchs by the Archbishop of Canterbury in England, or the crowning of kings and emperors by the Pope. It is the public submission to the higher power that is important, not necessarily the manner in which it is done. The third monarchical measurement is whether or not the ruler permits a participatory government. In tyrannical rule, all participation in government is done at the express permission of the tyrant, and he or she may remove those people with impunity at any time. In a monarchical form of government, participation is the right of the participants. In modern day, nearly the only participants are democratically elected without any approval by the monarch. These forms of government are known as constitutional monarchies. Before the form of republic was in vogue all across the world, the primary form of participation in a monarch's government was one of family. The lords and ladies of a country were the monarch's direct or extended family. These lords and ladies had permission to rule in their own right, their own properties. Essentially, the ancient monarchs ruled a land of self-ruling, small, local, nearly autonomous lands. There are no forms of rule with smaller or more local government than traditional monarchies. There would be, of course, other families unrelated to the monarch, from which the monarch or the ruler would be able to marry suitable members to his offspring. And this constituted a form of rule, something like a small village, in which all the local lords and ladies would know each other, and politics surrounded traditional values, such as the raising of children, marriage, faith, the care and order of your own household, etc. What is important to understand is that these lords and ladies ruled in their own right, and the king could not order them to his whims. He would have the ability to tax them and to censor them, but he would not be able to govern their people. The rule of the individuals was done by the local lords. When a ruler attempted to usurp the right to rule of the local lords, he essentially undermined his family and his community, and he ceased to be a monarch when he attempts this. Examples of this are Peter the Great in Russia, who, by a series of clever, calculated pieces of legislation, forced the boyars, or the Russian nobility, to spend part of their time in the capital with him, and to go through his bureaucratic office to officiate matters that once were within their own purview. Without ever having to go to war, or shedding any blood at all, Peter transformed the whole Russian state into one where participation was at the mercy of the tyrant. King Louis XIV is another example of a ruler who stole the right of familial participation in government from his people. While there are a plethora of examples with similar conclusions, these two are especially illuminating, in that both resulted in the bloody dethroning of the rulers by a people that felt disenfranchised by government. One man cannot rule a nation by himself. He must have others to help. But how the others who participate in that rule are allowed to do so determines the form of government in that nation. The three monarchical measurements are, again, hereditary succession, submission to God, and participatory rule. Any ruler who violates a single one of these primal tenets subverts the form of government away from monarchical and towards tyrannical. So the next time you hear someone say that a king and a tyrant are the same thing, just send them this video so that they can tell the difference for themselves.